Great. Okay, here we go. Hold on to your chairs. A few quick slides about Ruby. So for those of you who are not Ruby regulars, you'll have an idea of what we do, particularly around how to solve this problem. So we produce publications, we do research and produce things like the Directory of Rural Organizations came out last October and others. We have regular monthly briefings as pictured here. Chloe Maxman, a senator in rural Maine who's now started Dirt Road Organizing. Chloe was one of our presenters. We've been doing that the first Wednesday of every month at 4 p.m. Eastern. We've been doing that for 2+ years. Really solid, excellent briefings. We need to get Mike back on there. And we have a podcast called Two Worlds, One Country. And that podcast features some of the same people who come to briefings and others as well, but all with interesting insights into the origins of the divide and what can be done. Among our reports and resources, in the fall of 2022, right after the midterms, we released Can Democrats Succeed in Rural America? It's still very relevant. The first half of it comes right from the mouths of Democrats who ran in rural districts in 25 different states and either won their races or beat the partisan lean substantially. So these are some real insights into how Dems can run better in rural. And then more recently, just last September, we released the Rural New Deal, a joint effort with Progressive Democrats of America. I just did a training on it last night. We're promoting it and won't talk much about it now except to say that it is a bottom-up platform, a federal platform, but bottom-up for solving untold rural problems, building more prosperous and resilient economies. So we're very excited about it and would love any partners in helping to spread the word. We also have a community works initiative that is our effort at trust building, one of our efforts at trust building. And that community works is underway in actually a lot of places across the country, but in a targeted way in rural Virginia and now launching in rural Georgia. And in a nutshell, community works tests the idea that what if Democrats start showing up in groups, en masse, to do things like picking up trash in the community, fixing, repairing buildings or homes, helping to distribute food, blood drives, et cetera, et cetera. If we started showing up en masse regularly, 2-3 times a month, we believe we can start to rebuild trust. And so that's what Community Works is testing. Our rural-urban divide is our signature training, and what you're going to get for the next 10 or 12 minutes from me is a quick sampling of what that is, because we believe at Ruby that unless we understand the real underlying causes for how we got into this mess, then our efforts going forward won't be as effective as they should be. So how did we? Well, Heather McGhee's framing is a great way to start. In her book, The Sum of Us, she says that the plutocrats have always known that solidarity is the answer, that the sum of us can accomplish far more than just some of us. That's why the forces seeking to keep the economic rules exactly as they are aim to cut off any sense of empathy white people who are struggling might develop for also struggling people of color. And so our question, really one of the things that drives Ruby, is why has this been so successful? This cutting off or reversing of growing empathy among working class and poor white people towards folks in the same situation of a different color. And what do we have to do to build that kind of multiracial solidarity among working folks that Heather McGhee says is exactly what the plutocrats fear? Now, one thing for us to keep in mind, there's books out there now about white rural rage and all of that, but in fact, the alienation that people feel, the mistrust towards government particularly, but towards major institutions, is not a phenomenon just of rural whites. The Frameworks Culture of Change projects in a 2023 study found that this kind of thinking, the system is rigged, is extremely commonplace. They say at the core of the mindset is the idea that the system is being rigged by those in power at the expense of ordinary people. We see this mindset applied by people of all political ideologies, but in very different ways. So again, it isn't just rural folks or white folks who feel this, it's very common. And we see it in the sort of extraordinarily high levels of support for Donald Trump. A lot of people think Trump is all about the countryside. Well, he does have a lot of strong support in the countryside, but out of 74 million voters in 2020, 58 million were in cities, suburbs, and exurbs, far more than in rural. And between 2016 and 2020, his vote share increased among Blacks, Latinos, and women. So again, we can't just say, oh, the problem is these kind of old school racist white people in the countryside. Even a recent poll as close as 2020 of this, April of this year, showed an overall 44% favorability rating for Trump among voters of color. So all rather startling, but also all indicators that this alienation, this sense of mistrust, is really widespread in the country. So really quickly, to summarize what we consider to be the underlying causes of the rural-urban divide, I'm going to walk you through two scenarios, two different views of how this divide came to be. This is the first view, that the combination of technological change and globalization during the latter part of the last century into the new century led to the decline of 20th century jobs, blue-collar jobs, factory work, farming, etc., and to the elimination of so many small businesses and family farms. And that as this happened, what began to emerge was a knowledge economy, so-called, that required a college degree and in many cases more advanced education than that. Unfortunately, according to this view, most rural people, because they pine for the good old days, have been left behind by the knowledge economy. Only the educated and the young embrace it, and they leave rural areas. So as a result, the people left behind in rural places and small towns become very dependent on the government that they hate, and transfer payments and other ways, and their worlds become increasingly insular, increasingly closed in many respects. Because these same folks lack much education, formal education, they're easily misled, they're easily manipulated, and they end up voting against their own interests, as so many people say, or as President Obama put it, clinging to their guns and religion. And so the net result of all of this, according to this view, is that rural voters have adopted a politics of grievance, particularly of racial grievance. And as a result of that, they fight against the very people and things that would help them and instead lash out at others who are also struggling. This is the sort of view of the rural divide, rural-urban divide, from the New York Times, mainstream media, MSNBC, etc. But we see it differently. At Ruby, we have, while we know some of that is true, overall we think it's misleading. We believe that the rural-urban divide started primarily with bad trade and economic policies. Trade and economic policies that led to essentially an abandonment and a betrayal of rural and small towns. And as this happened, traditional jobs, bread and butter industries, anchor businesses were dismissed, they were denigrated, small businesses and family farms were increasingly absorbed, crushed, offshored, and taken in by a group of corporations that got bigger and bigger with fewer and fewer constraints on them. What did we have? Well, this beginning in 1980 was massive closing of factories, Mike will talk about that, disappearance of farms, either through bankruptcy or absorption into larger farms, and a general economic and social decline. While this was going on, from our perspective, political elites from both parties and the experts who both drive and speak for those elites basically spoke to prop up this system that rural and small town people believe were rigged against them, was largely justified and propped up by that class of elites. So this helped to spawn this very strong alienation from government, from major institutions. It's a national phenomenon, but it's particularly deep in small town and rural. And the net result, in our view, is what people feel is a righteous anger and a desire to rebel against the government these elites and experts and the professional class that they think has rigged the system against them. Let's get into that just a little more closely. What are those underlying causes? Well, as I've already said, it's an economy that hasn't worked for most Americans. That's the foundations, 80%. And in communities of color and working class towns and rural areas, the predominant feature has been economic insecurity. You might be doing okay today, but you just don't have much confidence about tomorrow, let alone your kids' fortunes. Rather than a trickle-down economy, as Ronald Reagan promised, we've had a suck-up economy with wealth and opportunity pulled away from small businesses, family farms, Main Street, et cetera, to fewer and fewer, bigger and bigger corporations. That concentration of wealth has been going on for 40 years. And so while the Republican Party and Democratic Party have offered different approaches to this, it has in many respects, at least from an economic standpoint, been a bipartisan betrayal. Again, I'm not somebody who says that the Democrats and Republicans are or have been the same, that it's a uniparty. But the fact of the matter is some very important steps that have hurt working class people, factory towns, rural areas were either championed or signed off on by major Democrats over the last 40 years. This has changed pretty dramatically with Joe Biden, but up until that point. This concentration of wealth, it's bad for the economy overall, the corporatization of our politics and economy. It's especially bad in rural because big boys like Tyson and other corporations simply wield more power in rural because rural economies are less diverse considerably and have fewer alternatives. So when somebody like Tyson exercises their muscle in a bad way, there's not much people can do. And it isn't just ag, because in fact, most of the kind of anchor industries that have characterized rural economies for the last 40 years have seen this precipitous loss in jobs. Timber, coal mining, furniture manufacturing, textile plants, parts factories. Also during this period, we had this precipitous decline in unions. Again, it didn't just happen. It happened in large part because we collectively changed the rules to make it easier for corporations to undermine unions and union drives and harder for unions to mount a drive and maintain themselves once they were in power. So that decline in unions, you see there, the orange line mirrored a rise in inequality. All of this together led to the second fundamental cause that we see, the second underlying cause, this collective sense of neglect and betrayal, and what now is most people are calling an anti-elitism, where people feel that it's a group of elites that rig the system for themselves and against them. And of course, many progressives believe that as well, but the difference is among rural people especially, it's city folks, it's academics, it's intellectuals, Democrats, environmentalists. They see us as the people who rigged the system, along with the plutocrats, I should say. Kathy Kramer, in her incredible study, The Politics of Resentment of Rural Wisconsin, she's found that racism was definitely part of this growing resentment in the countryside. But as she said, we're failing to fully understand these perspectives when we assume that racism is more fundamental than calculations of injustice. The way these folks described the world to me, their basic concern was that people like them in places like theirs were overlooked and disrespected. And paraphrasing now from Nick and Dan's book, The Rural Voter, they said something very similar. Kathy characterized that sense of collective sense of betrayal and an identity as a rural consciousness. And Nick and Dan refer to the sense of a linked fate. And during the Q&A, Nick may want to expand on this, but essentially what they found is that in rural areas, people are much, much more economically integrated than in cities and suburbs, by which they mean it's harder to live in a bubble because the wealthy, the working class, and the poor are all in pretty close proximity to each other. It's hard to send your kids to school or go to the grocery store or simply drive down the road without seeing people in a very different economic state. And so as a result, even people who are doing fine themselves, many of them also share this sense of betrayal and grievance. And one other element of this anti-elitism that's really important for us to understand is how rural people see the experts. On our side, we tend to love experts. We roll out experts. We quote experts all the time, but the experts aren't always right. Bill Clinton and Robert Rubin, his Treasury Secretary, stated in the signing ceremony for NAFTA that it would create at least 1 million net new jobs in its first 5 years. That didn't happen, and quite the opposite happened in factory towns and rural communities where jobs were devastated. So the experts aren't always right. And they weren't right on vaccines. Gwen Johnson, who lives in Letcher County, Kentucky, was asked by a fella in Massachusetts, they'd become friends, why so many people in Eastern Kentucky, where she is, were not getting vaccinated during the height of the pandemic. And the first word out of Gwen's mouth was OxyContin. The doctors and pharmacists told us this, and the government regulators said it was okay, safe and not addictive. It devastated our communities, so some folks don't trust the experts on vaccines either. One other element of this anti-expertise is that many rural and working class people feel that experts are elites, that they're kind of rolled out by, they're trained in the same institutions, they live the same culture of the elite class who they already don't trust. And that, as Kathy Kramer found, and I've found this too, rural people generally think that they've got expertise, they've got insight, they've got wisdom to offer, but nobody ever asks. The third underlying cause is a very strong resistance to government, especially regulations. And we've seen that all over the country. It's ironic because rural people's lives, more so than suburban and urban dwellers, are more directly and more intimately connected to the environment. They need a healthy environment, and yet many have developed what I call regulatory aversion, the belief that regulations aren't necessary, they're intrusive, and they don't help the average person. So where does this come from? Well, of course, Fox News and all of that, but also from the fact that, again, sometimes regulations fail. As in Southern West Virginia 14 years ago, when 40 miners, or 39, excuse me, I'm sorry, 29 miners were killed during the Upper Big Branch mine explosion. 29 miners. What we found out after the explosion was that that mine had been cited for safety violations for over 500 times in the prior year and over 60 times in the preceding month, and yet nothing was done. So again, this regulatory aversion in part comes from the failure sometimes of regulations to protect. Just a little more from me. The fourth cause we identify is this sense that Arlie called feeling like strangers in their own land. Arlie spent 5 years with people in rural and small town Louisiana, wrote this book, and what she found was that these folks felt, they gave her the image of being stuck in line, of being people who worked hard, played by the rules, but they never got anywhere. They were treading water or moving backwards. And so they ended up blaming others, immigrants in some cases, people of color, for what they perceived as cutting in line. And again, while in Arlie's study it was white rural Louisianans, it isn't just white people who share this sense of alienation. We tend to think that people of color, and for that matter, young people, but people of color just automatically identify as liberal and feel the same way we do about most of the major issues. But as you can see in this recent survey, only about a fourth identified as liberal. 3/4 say they're either moderate or conservative. And that's in large part because about 70% of voters of color are working class, just about the same percentage as rural. And many of those folks, 52% of Latino voters, 40% of Black voters, believe that the Democrats have betrayed them on economic issues, but also simultaneously have moved too far to the left on a range of cultural and social issues. At least to a degree, that's felt. I'm going to let two people in real quick. Give me just a moment. Okay, so last set of slides. This is leading into Mike. So we have a two-party political system, for good and for bad. One party was historically the party of the working class. But we really shifted over the 40-year period to being much more a party of the professional class. And Larry Summers copped to that when he was asked about all of the people displaced by NAFTA, all the people who lost their livelihood. And he said, well, displaced white workers weren't heavily on our radar screen. This is a guy who was absolutely key to both the Clinton and Obama administrations. And he's basically saying, yeah, working class folks, we're not thinking about them much. And Chuck Schumer said the same thing in 2016 as the election was coming up between Hillary Clinton and Trump. People asked him about the loss of working class voters, and he said, for every blue collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we'll pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs in Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin. So this alienation comes in part because, in fact, the Democratic Party has moved away, again, with a major shift in the Biden years from working class people. And it's also a shift in language, as my brilliant colleague Erica Edelson talks about in her book and in the work she does with Ruby. A lot of folks, I've seen people like Paul Krugman and Paul Waldman, when he wrote his book, questioning whether elites really do ridicule, put down, condescend to farmers and working people. They'll say, I never hear that. But my goodness, for those of us who live in the countryside, it is commonplace. This is Michael Bloomberg talking at a tech conference. Says, I could teach anybody, even people in this room, to be a farmer. You dig a hole, you put a seed in, you put dirt on top, add water, up comes the corn. You could learn that. Then we had 300 years of the industrial society. You can put a piece of metal on a lathe, you turn the crank in the direction of the arrow, and you can have a job. Now comes the information economy. It's fundamentally different because it's built around replacing people with technology, and the skills you have to learn are how to think and analyze, and that's a whole degree level different. You have a different skill set. You have to have a lot more gray matter. So here's Michael Bloomberg basically saying factory workers, blue-collar workers, and farmers are idiots. They don't need intelligence. They don't need analysis. They don't need to think. And it ain't just Bloomberg. Major liberal or even mainstream publications in the Trump era and beyond, dumb hicks, idiot supporters of Donald Trump. Be happy for coal miners losing their health insurance. That's what they voted for. Finally get to the bottom of Trump supporters. They're garbage human beings. Don't have sympathy for those hillbillies. This is kind of a bit of a stereotype, but often the prevailing view among liberals and progressives. So Ruby has a strategy for overcoming this, and we'll talk about that during the Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Mike and Lauren now. You're muted, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anthony. We're going to talk about the Factory Town initiative that we started about 3 years ago. My partner Lauren, who's been key to it, is on as well, and she may have some comments, during or after the conversation as well. Let's go to the first slide. So this is the this is the chart that basically started the Factory Town project. I was working with a bunch of analysts after the 2020 election and looking at numbers of different kinds of counties, and we ended up dividing counties in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania, and we also looked at actually Western New York. We wanted to judge whether a county was urban, suburban, college, or whether it was more sort of agriculturally based rural versus Some more rural counties actually have a lot of manufacturing in them and are not totally agriculturally based. A lot of mid-sized counties have factories in them or used to have factories in them. So we looked at the different kinds of counties, and what we discovered was that these are the shifts in the net vote margin for Democrats, in these different kinds of counties, in the 10 states that we looked at. And what we found is that Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden actually did better in big cities than Barack Obama had done, which no one, that's not something that you would necessarily expect. Those two candidates did better in the college towns. They did better in the suburbs. They did worse in the strictly rural counties, but given that it was a high turnout election, not that much worse than you would expect in a high turnout election. But where we got killed was those manufacturing counties, and we looked at counties that had more than the average share of manufacturing workers, building and construction trades workers, and in those counties we just got murdered. We being the Democrats in this case. So that was what got us started. We realized that we really needed to have a place-based focus and look at these counties where Trump had gained so much support and Republicans had gained so much support in recent years. Next slide. So, and in that very first study that we did in 2021, this is another way of putting what you just saw. There was approximately a 2 million a person vote away from Democrats in those counties, and toward the GOP in those counties. Next slide. So we just came out with a new report and new polling a few days ago, and we and another organization partnered to do 2 new polls by Lake Research in 4 states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Obviously, the first 3 are presidential battleground states. Ohio is an important state in a lot of different ways. So in those states, if we won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Joe Biden would get 270 electoral votes. There's no way he wouldn't. If we lost them, Trump would be the president, no matter what else happened. So these are states that we're very focused on. The current base voter for Democrats in these states is in big danger of being eroded, and you all have seen the polling. Biden's support has been slipping due to a variety of factors. Inflation is a big one. Gaza is a big one. Other issues are driving down Biden's support in these base voter counties in urban areas, and so there's a real danger in terms of Biden winning re-election. Next slide. So just want to have you take a look at the demographics in these factory town, what we call factory town counties. The voters there tend to be older, but not overwhelmingly. About a third of them are over 65. One thing you should note is that people think of these counties as more Republican. They're actually about even: 43% Democrat, 41% Republican. There's still a lot of union members, not as many as there used to be. These counties used to be 50-60% union. They're now 38% union, but that's a lot of union households. And I just want to note on race This is not about all the white people in smaller counties versus all the Black and Hispanic people in urban counties. 21% of the voters in these factory town counties, which includes mid-size and some smaller counties, 21% of them are people of color. And that number, by the way, is growing rapidly. 25% overall of rural America is people of color. It's not all white folks in these counties. Next slide. So this is from another poll, not the one we did, and I'm just going to go quickly through some big points here. But there was a recent poll of rural voters done by the Rural Democracy Initiative, which was an outstanding poll. But on many issues, I would even categorize it as most issues, rural voters are actually more on the progressive side. More than 70% are pro-abortion rights. These voters prefer when you read them, a description of economic philosophy, when you read them what's called middle out economics, or middle out or up from the bottom economics, versus a description of trickle down economics that, as a Republican might talk about economics. Rural voters prefer the progressive description. Rural voters strongly believe, by big numbers in the 70s, that the wealthy and big corporations have rigged the economy. They strongly support taxing the wealthy and profitable corporations. And just a note in terms of swing voters, there's a lot of rural voters that are swing voters, that are yet undecided or that could easily shift. Those voters tend to be heavily weighted toward younger rural voters, the people of color rural voters, and independent women who live in rural areas. Next slide. So in the 2024 election, in the polling that we did in these counties, it's an absolute toss-up between Trump and Biden, very, very close margin of error, and 12% are what the media has come to refer to as double haters. They really don't like either Trump or Biden. A lot of that 12%, by the way, are people who normally vote for Democrats. So that's both a warning sign, but also, maybe we can get them back. The base vote for Democrats has clearly been is being eroded by all the things going on, the issues as well as the third party candidates, and just the general lack of enthusiasm. Biden is losing some of the traction he was gaining with working class and rural voters in 2020. Biden basically won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin because he gained just enough with working class voters compared to Hillary Clinton. He's lost ground with those voters, at least according to the current polling. And then, as one example, 33% of rural voters are now supporting him compared to 42% in 2020. And just a note, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin cannot be won. If you just look at the numbers, just add up the numbers, county by county, precinct by precinct, those three states cannot be won only through or mainly through big city and college-educated suburban voters. These are heavily blue-collar states. About 50% of the voters in these states are these factory town working class voters. Candidates who were very successful in these states, Fetterman, Shapiro, Whitmer, Evers in Wisconsin, they were all relatively strong vote getters with working class folks and in factory town counties. Next slide. So one thing to keep in mind about rural and factory town voters is the economic and life hardships that these folks have been through have been severe. More than half of these voters have stories for themselves or for close family members of having lost jobs in recent years, having had trouble with their housing, having had trouble with their health insurance, have trouble with their retirement income being endangered or lost, have trouble with disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health issues. These are counties that are that are heavy targets for the drug companies and OxyContin and opioids. So there's these folks who've been through a lot, and so to try to make the case that, hey, everything's going great now for you is not the case you want to be making with these voters. And I'll just note, this slide mentions 2/3 of these voters have major caregiving responsibilities for somebody else in their family, a parent, a grandparent, a child who's got disabilities, or a brother who's got disabilities. So these are significant hardships. The good news is that folks get that corporate greed, with the wealthiest 1% and CEOs rigging the rules. That's what they blame for these hardships as the number one thing to blame. And so they are naturally populist and inclined toward populism. They do have concerns about high taxes, especially on them. They do blame the government for a lot of the inflation, although there's a message that works to bring them back. Next slide. So I'll be honest about one thing that's troubling. There's a perception by the voters in these counties that Democrats are obsessed with transgender rights above all other things, above anything that matters in terms of kitchen table economics, and that's something that we have to struggle with. We believe we tested a message about a right-wing message about transgender rights versus a populist economic message, and we won on that test. But we won by only 46-43. Last time we tested that a year ago, we won by a lot more than that. So this is an issue that's on people's minds, but if you talk about the economy, you can still win a lot of these folks over. The biggest thing the Democrats are rated poorly on is they perceive that we don't have an economic plan that will help them. They think maybe we have an economic plan to help people other than them. And this is the other thing that Anthony was talking about in his slides. But their perception is that Democrats don't have an economic plan to help them. The other bit of good news from a Democratic perspective is negative perceptions of Republicans have also intensified. These are not folks who are like, oh, the Democrats suck and I love the Republicans. These are voters who think everybody sucks, Democrats and Republicans, they believe that the Republicans are aligned with wealthy corporations, the top 1%, and the people who have caused hardship in their lives. Next slide. So the Democratic, the economic messaging that we tested does compete well, not overwhelmingly winning, but well with the culture war message. Voters respond very well to messages emphasizing a strong middle class, but also, and this is key, retirement issues are really important for rural and factory town voters. You have to include retirement issues as part of your pitch. Next slide. So this slide sort of is self-explanatory. These voters want policies that are specifically about them, that specifically help them and work for them. These voters are winnable if you talk about those kinds of economic policies and emphasize them. Next slide, unless that's the last one. Okay, getting the message out effectively. One thing about these voters, and this did not used to be true, but right now it is. Rural voters, factory town voters are strongly pro-union. They didn't used to be. 20 years ago, rural voters didn't like unions, but now they've come to recognize that corporations have too much power, and that unions have the, if they're strong, have the ability to push back against corporations. A second thing I would say is we need to do old-fashioned community organizing. We need to do, via social media. We need to build trusted communities online, and we need to do it in a way that's localized. People don't relate very well to national sources or national news. Anthony talked about the whole expert thing, and he's absolutely right about that. We need localized messaging from trusted communities on and offline. We need to be talking about roads, bridges, airports, new drinking water systems, new businesses opening up, new factories opening up, and we're doing pilot projects about this in different states. Next slide. So this is the last slide. I think that the number one message is we're not going to change these dynamics overnight. We are progressives and Democrats are, in a tough spot in rural America for all the reasons Anthony talked about. But we can make progress. And this election, like the last few, is going to be a game of inches. If we gain just a few votes in a lot of these counties, that can be the difference between winning and losing the presidency, the Senate, the House, state legislative races, up and down the line. And so we need to fight this out, and we need to have a long-term strategy that will really bring back working class voters, and especially those in rural areas. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the discussion and to any questions you all have.
Thanks so much, Mike. That was really both sobering but encouraging at the same time. So we ran a bit long, but we still have at least 10 minutes, and Mike and I can both stay over a bit if people want. So let's just open it up. You can either physically raise your hand if you're on camera. If you're not, you can do the signal for raising your hand, and Sandy's going to get us started with that. So please just kind of get in line, ask questions, make comments, and just try to keep your questions and comments concise so we can get as many folks in as possible. Go ahead, Sandy.
Great. Yes. So I'm trying to, kind of understand as far as Biden's messaging, how he's been, what he supported, his legislation. He talks of unions. I'm listening to kind of all your bullet points. And I get as far as, certain Democrats that you've spoken about, like saying the wrong things and not respecting rural communities. But what I'm trying to understand as far as from Trump, as far as what he did during his administration, helping the working class and just trying to understand the psyche of rural voters as far as what he did in, tax cuts for the wealthy, how they view how he helped them during his prior administration, given everything that Biden's done. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll weigh in, and then Mike, you go. So two things. On the Biden side, We at Ruby normally are working just very long term to rebuild trust, to change the direction of the party and politics. But this year, we're actually quite focused on the 2024 election in a number of different ways. One of the small but important things is we have developed and are disseminating, it's on our website, what we call progressive economic policy wins. And would be happy to share that with anybody who requests it. But also, if you go to our website and just go to, I think it's maybe steps you can take or action you can take, you'll find it in the list there. It is extraordinary, the body, and Joan also had a question about this, the body of policies the Biden administration has made, steps to level the playing field for unions, the incredibly aggressive and effective antitrust agenda across the economy virtually, as well as major investments in rural, in manufacturing, and small business. It's a fierce agenda like none we've had. So for those of you who aren't aware of that, our little progressive economic wins is an entree to that with links, just the highlights. So that's a place to start so you can be talking. And believe me, lots of Dems don't know about this. Lots of Dems think he hasn't done anything either. And it's just crazy. In terms of Trump, my speculation is basically this. Rural voters, at least, Mike might agree that this includes a lot of factory town, small town working class, have such a long-standing sense of betrayal by political elites that Trump was like the first guy, aside from Bernie, to come along and say, I hear you, you're right, you got screwed, and I'm going to do something about it. He goes into office for 4 years. What does he do? Hardly anything, although there was not significant inflation. So that is a significant difference. But most of all, they don't have much expectation from politicians anyway, because they think they're all full of shit and they never deliver on their promises. So they look back on the Trump years, they look at the current Biden, not knowing all of those major accomplishments, and they think, we gave Biden a shot, let's go back to Trump. He at least gets us. That's my sense of why Trump is seen in a much more favorable light than he ought to be. Mike, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I think one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about this, and we addressed this in our report and in some past reports, but rural America increasingly, and these factory counties are news deserts. Newspapers are shutting down or are much thinner than they used to be. Local radio is shutting down. Most local TV these days, over 50% of local TV news in these areas is owned by Sinclair or a couple of media companies that are closely aligned with Sinclair in terms of their right-wing politics. So people just are not getting much news from conventional sources. They also don't trust the national news. If they look at cable news, they think all of the commentators are biased, and which many of them are, and they don't have much faith in that. So one of the reasons that I think doing local organizing and building trusted networks, both online and offline, is that people are looking for information and not finding it. And so, if all they hear about on Trump is what their pro-Trump neighbors, who tend to be very talkative, right, and very, very loud in conversation, they're not hearing much about Trump or Biden from the news. They're not hearing much about who deserves credit for what. One of the things that we noted in some of the research we've been doing is that people are hearing more and more about good things that Biden has done, but not necessarily with Biden's name attached. If there's people aren't necessarily giving him credit for lower prescription drug prices, for example, because they just don't know it was him that was really pushing that. roads and bridges. A lot of the local county officials who are Republicans are trying to take credit for that. And because there's no news sources in these areas, sometimes they get away with it. So part of it is just that lack of information about, what's going on and on the good things that are happening, whether Biden or somebody else or Trump, deserves credit or blame for things. So I think that's one of the really key issues.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. So I'm getting some good questions and comments in the chat. I'm going to go to Craig. Also, Nick, I want you to just feel free to weigh in to add anything because you've studied rural voters and their proclivities and shifts more than anybody. But go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, real quickly, thank you for this opportunity, Mike. Just want to back that up about the conservative firewall of press. I am in Northwest Ohio. I am the Ohio Democratic Party Rural Caucus Chair. I am also a candidate for the Ohio House this year, and I'm a director on the Ohio Public Banking Coalition. We have put forth a draft bill this year. We were unsuccessful in getting it fully vetted by the LSC, but we are trying to create a bank, a state public bank like the Bank of North Dakota.
Yeah.
This would help so many rural economies. I've given 5 speeches in the last 5 weeks in rural Ohio, in this part, in front of over 500 people, and it energizes the Democratic base because we're going back into our roots, rebuilding these rural economies. As you said, we used to have a lot of unions here, up and down this area, and we've lost those jobs due to the NAFTA. Sherrod Brown's name still rings good here and rings true here because he opposed NAFTA so vocally back in '92. The other thing I'm working on a national basis, I'm on the advisory board, and I don't know if you people know about this, but HR 4052, which is proposed by Danny Davis, is a national infrastructure bank. This is modeled after the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that we did back in the New Deal times to finance all those New Deal programs. We are trying to get this bill passed in Congress. It has 35 co-sponsors right now. Again, these are the things, if we can get this kind of legislation in front of the national and the local press, then you're going to start getting these guys off of their social agenda and onto an economic agenda that they can't defend. And like you said before, I've been in so many conversations with local officials here. They refuse to acknowledge what Biden has done for them, but they will spend that money. But they like this public bank idea. It energizes even the Republican people. So I'd like to put that out there. You could read more about it in my website, sportsforohio.com, or you go to the Ohio Public Banking Coalition and read about it. Thank you.
That's terrific, Craig. Thank you.
I'm a huge fan of public banking. It's a great issue.
We are too as well. The North Dakota example, which is over a century old, has been amazing. In good times and in bad, it has done the citizens well. And we're also in conversation with the folks for pushing for the National Infrastructure Bank, which we also think would be terrific. Our Rural New Deal has many of those same policies and would be greatly advanced by a national infrastructure bank. It could be spent, the one that Alan Minsky and PDA and we came up with. One more quick comment. My wife texted me, she didn't put it in the chat, something that you alluded to, Craig, that lots of Republicans, both people who are state representatives as well as congressional representatives, take credit for the IRA or ARPA or infrastructure money when it comes to their community and completely ignore the fact that they fought it and voted against it, and now they're taking credit for it. That's a kind of shamelessness that has just become the norm in the Republican Party. It's something we just have to accept because that's who they are now. Okay. Also, I want to mention, delighted to have, let's see, Brianta Maxwell on the call. She's the new Rural Coalitions Director for the DNC. So Brianta, really happy to have you on the call and look forward to working with you on this. Did you want to say anything about anything you've heard here or any comments?
Yeah, well, I'll be quick and I'll just say, like, I left my information in the chat, so I would love for everyone to email me. Let's chat, let's set some meetings. I plan to start traveling soon. I took a lot of notes. I am just particularly just excited to work with you to figure out how we can make sure that make sure the rural communities are an emphasis going forward, because as Chevrolet used to say, the rural community is heartbeat of America, and I want to make sure that the world knows that. So I will be available anytime. So let's work together. And this was an amazing event. And I look forward to chatting with you all again. Thank you for letting me join too. Thank you guys.
Oh, that's great, Brianna. So glad you're in that position. We'll definitely be working with you. We've got a question from Laura.
Yeah, I put this question in the chat also, so sorry for the repetition.
Okay.
But
Okay.
so I'm currently a college student, and I was just wondering if there was any advice for how more college students can get involved.
Sure. So that's a really legit question. And it's also the case that the polls are showing young people 18 to 29, that certainly includes most college age, very uncertain, not thrilled with Joe Biden, and even some of them shifting to the Republican Party. So this is a group of people that's getting bigger and bigger as our voting, as a block of voters who we're not doing so well with. So your question's critical. Ruby doesn't have a specific strategy with young people. I'll just mention a couple things and then see if others, maybe who are 45 years younger than me, have some advice to respond to your question. But from our point of view, while abortion access is definitely something that motivates young people and should be talked about, and the fact that it is so under threat unless we hold on to the presidency and the Senate, that's one thing that's an obvious. But we think that the whole thing of the kitchen table issues is too often neglected with young people. So the categories I'd put them into is what the administration is doing to save people money, including not only student debt relief, but going after the hidden fees that have become part of everything from concert tickets to airlines, to credit card debt, to insulin and other drugs. So I think hitting that message doesn't just work for middle-aged people. I think young people are struggling financially. And so talking about all the different things, and some of them are listed in our Progressive Economic Wins document, that would be one thing I would suggest. And the other thing is the economic opportunity. Because this administration is taking such long-term steps, the pro-union steps, the anti-monopoly steps, the pro-small business steps, the pro-education, including not just traditional college, but vocational school. All of those things will help lead to more opportunities when your cohort graduates. So it's been a pretty dismal time for young folks coming out of college with a lot of debt and what seemed like bleak opportunities. This administration's taken a lot of steps that should help shift that. So I don't know if that helps, Laura, but that's some thoughts from my end. Mike or others, do you want to comment on that?
Just a quick note, there are some great youth-oriented organizations out there that are doing really good work this year. Voters for Tomorrow is a great youth and student led organization. Blue Future, which is a Democratic PAC that focuses on young people, is a great organization. Next Gen is the biggest youth oriented organization. So connect with those organizations online, and those are great organizations to work with.
Thanks so much, Laura. I hope that was helpful a little bit. We'll take one more question or comment from Murray, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, Murray.
Okay, thanks. Nice to meet you again, and good to hear from everybody. Some quick things from me. I ask people, have you ever seen Trump in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and dirty hands? To claim he's a blue collar person doesn't match the facts of what's going on. Hopefully people have read Project 2025 and seen what's going to happen there. I'm personally on Social Security and Medicare, and that's being threatened by them. Also, hopefully people are aware of the patrioticmillionaires.org, that they have plans, and they talk strongly about taxing the wealthy, and they suggest that and talk about that. And then a quick example, I live right up against South Dakota. I'm the little bump in Minnesota that sticks there. I talked to a guy from South Dakota just 2 weeks ago. And he was saying that some Minnesotans moved to South Dakota so their taxes could be less. And yet the roads are horrible over there. And he said they're talking about even having to go back to gravel roads because they aren't being taken care of. And that's the state, if you remember, that's being run by Kristi Noem, who's dancing around the country talking about other things, and she isn't even taking care of her own state. So, there's a lot out there. There's a lot more I could share, but I thank you and I appreciate all you guys are doing here.
Great. Thanks for that, Murray. Those are also great resources. Absolutely. So there's a lot of groups working on this for sure. So just to wrap up, there are some more questions and comments. B. Smith in the chat says back to you, Laura, that she thinks inviting you to kind of pull together like-minded young folks and work with them to figure out what the strategy should be, and then maybe draw on some of those groups that Mike mentioned that are national groups that could help with that. That would absolutely be the preferred. The last thing I'll say is just that I think Mike and I are both available. I'm going to quickly pop my email into the chat as well. Most of you know it because a lot of you are familiar with Ruby, but for those who don't, but we would love to work with you on any and all of these issues. We would love to absolutely share the resources that Mike has with this, both the problem and the solutions. And then Ruby, again, has certain things like the Rural New Deal that captures some of this, or our document that we'd love to share and work with you on. So all of that said, thank you again very much for your participation in this. I think it's been a great gathering. Appreciate Mike working with you. And we'll see many of you, we hope, again.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, y'all.
Take care.
Thank you.